Wednesday night at my college, and a few friends and I were bored, so we decided to make the most of our free time and take a trip to Foxwoods Casino. In Connecticut, if you've ever been there, you'll know that Foxwoods is situated on an Indian reservation in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing around except for the casino with maybe a few old houses scattered here and there. We arrived at the casino around 10 p.m. There were 5 of us, 3 girls and 2 guys. We spent the night playing blackjack, and around 2 a.m. we called it quits and decided it was time to head back to campus. It was about a 2-hour drive home, and I was behind the wheel. My friend, who was riding shotgun, and I were feeling good, still thinking about the money we'd won. The girls, on the other hand, were a little more uneasy. They kept commenting on how dark and gloomy it was outside. To be fair, the weather didn't help. New England fog is something else, and on top of that, it had started to rain. Driving in those conditions wasn't exactly easy. As we cruised through the darkness, the girls started to play up the whole Native American spiritual vibe, getting themselves worked up about the history of the land we were on. My friend and I didn't pay them much attention, though we thought it was funny. Just some spooky stuff to pass the time. Now, my old GPS would have had us on the main road right away, but I was using a new one that suggested a different route. I figured, why not? Maybe this way was quicker, so I followed it. Big mistake. As we made a left turn, all 3 girls in the back seat screamed at once. Startled, I glanced up and realized why. We had turned onto a road that looked straight out of a horror movie. There were no houses, just thick woods on either side. The road itself was paved, but barely. It didn't look well maintained at all. Still, the GPS said we only had a mile to go before we'd hit the highway again, so I told everyone to relax. The rain and fog made it tough to see, so I had to go slow. The atmosphere inside the car was tense. I noticed a pond on our right, and we started hearing noises from the woods around us. My friend tried to calm the girls down, saying it was just some deer, but they weren't having it. Honestly, I was starting to feel the fear creeping in too. The thought of breaking down in a place like this, I wasn't sure what I'd do if that happened. But the GPS said we were only 0.2 miles away from the highway, so I kept going. That's when the girls screamed again. I looked up. The road just ended. No warning, no signs, just trees. The pavement stopped abruptly, and the woods began. There was no construction, no detours, just the end of the road. My heart started racing. We were in complete darkness, except for my headlights. There were no street lights, no houses, nothing. I realized I had to make a full 180 and head back through the rear windshield to make sure I wasn't about to hit anything. The girls' faces told me they saw something, but I didn't want to know what it was. Then I turned around, and I saw it. At the end of the road, sitting right in front of us, was a dog. It was skinny and brown, about average size, and it was just sitting there, maybe 10 feet away. The fog and rain made it hard to see, but with my headlights on, we could make it out clearly. Then it moved, but instead of walking toward us, the dog stood up on its back legs, like a human. Everyone in the car went silent. My mind was racing. I couldn't back up too quickly because of the pond, but I wasn't sure what else to do. For a second, I even thought about running it over. I love animals. But in that moment, my survival instincts were taking over. But the dog didn't drop back down to all fours. It stayed on its hind legs, staring at us with this blank, dark gaze. Then it did something even more chilling. It brought its front paws together, slowly, and started to clap. I swear to God, this dog, if it even was a dog, just stood there, clapping, staring at us in complete silence. And then, to top it off, it gave us this twisted, deranged smile. It was the kind of smile that told me we weren't getting out of there unscathed. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned back around, slammed the car into reverse, and pulled off the fastest 180 I've ever done. I drove as fast as I could back toward the main road, not caring about the fog or the rain anymore. My heart was pounding the whole way, and the ride back to campus felt like it took forever. When we finally pulled up to the dorms, I've never been so relieved in my life. We all sat in the car for a minute, trying to process what had just happened. No one said a word for the rest of the night. I don't know what we saw out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back to Foxwoods, and I definitely don't ever want to be anywhere near that road again. Never. In the town where I grew up, there was this massive, abandoned house that had been empty since the mid-80s. The house used to belong to a prominent figure back in the 1930s or 40s, and when his daughter inherited it, she just up and left one day, leaving behind everything inside. For years, The place just stood there, untouched. I didn't even know about the house until 2012. By then, I had already moved into an apartment in the same town. Now, here's a weird detail. Before I found my apartment, I had this vivid dream about moving into a place. In the dream, I was in this large room, standing on a wooden platform suspended from the ceiling, and I could see up into an attic. I remember thinking, wow, I live here. But when I woke up, the dream faded, and I didn't think much more about it. A few months after I moved, some friends came over and started telling me stories about the abandoned house. They'd snuck inside a few times and had all kinds of creepy experiences. One friend mentioned feeling pain in her legs in a certain part of the house, even though she wasn't hurt. Others talked about seeing a mysterious dog that would vanish out of nowhere. One girl even swore she and her friends heard an old organ playing in the attic when they tried to contact a spirit. The stories were endless, strange reflections. In mirrors, weird dreams, after visiting, footsteps in empty rooms. It sounded like everything you'd expect from a haunted house. Naturally, I was dying to check it out. I've always wanted to see something paranormal for myself, so we made a plan. My friends were just as eager as I was, and we stocked up on flashlights, 8 of them, 2 for each of us. I still remember the rush of excitement as we walked toward the house, watching it slowly emerge in front of us. It was huge, even more impressive in person, but it was such a shame to see it wasted and abandoned like that. We found the way in around the back, through an opening that led down into the basement. As we approached, nerves kicked in, and even though none of us were religious, we joined hands and prayed. I guess it was more for comfort than anything else. There were 4 of us, all girls, and it was around 3:00 p.m. in the afternoon, so there was still plenty of daylight. The basement was exactly what you'd expect, dark and cold, even though it was summer. The space was filled with old items, tight nooks and creepy little corners where it felt like something might be lurking. It was straight out of a horror movie, but we didn't find anything too terrifying down there, so we moved up to the first floor. The first floor was filled with rooms, maybe around 10 of them, with 2 kitchens. We sat in one of the kitchens for a while, just listening to the house. At first, nothing happened. Then one of my friends suggested we try contacting a spirit. She knocked once on the wooden floor and asked, "If there's anyone here, can you knock me 10 or 15 seconds?" And then we heard it. One single knock from above. It was faint but clear. Could that be a coincidence? I whispered, but my friend didn't stop there. She knocked twice this time and asked, "If there's anyone here, can you knock twice like this?" We listened again, and sure enough, we heard 2 knocks from above. We all looked at each other, wide-eyed but silent. Then she asked, "Are you a man?" Knock once for yes. We waited, and after a brief pause, there was 1 knock. I started to feel uneasy. "Guys, what if there's a person in here?" I whispered, but before we could get too freaked out, we heard footsteps from upstairs. They didn't follow any specific pattern. They just sounded random, as if someone was pacing, but not going anywhere. I grabbed onto one of my friends, and the more scared we got, the louder and more intense the footsteps became. It was like whatever was up there was feeding off our fear. Despite the fear, we decided to go upstairs. There were even more rooms, but for some reason, these ones didn't feel as scary. We passed a few bathrooms and bedrooms until we reached a large room with a square platform hanging from the ceiling and a hole that led into the attic. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, but I didn't realize why until much later. It was exactly like the room from my dream. We moved on to another room, with one friend going in first, followed by another. But as the third girl was about to step inside, the door suddenly slammed shut, hard. None of us had touched it. We all screamed and bolted out of the house, running as fast as we could. Back at my place, we tried to process what had just happened. But despite the fear, we couldn't stay away. We kept going back to the house during the day. At night, it didn't matter. Strangely, nothing ever happened at night. All of the ghostly activities seemed to occur in broad daylight. We became obsessed, buying Ouija boards and pendulums, trying to communicate with whatever was in the house. We all started dreaming about the place. One of the girls even had a dream where the original owner of the house threatened to kill us if we ever returned. But of course we did. We explored every inch of that house, but anything valuable had been long stolen. What was left were dusty pieces of furniture, old photographs, typewriters, and random relics from the past. Telephones, beds, chairs, and of course, the organ in the attic, which was in terrible shape. Pressing the keys produced eerie, out-of-tune notes. There was one bedroom on the second floor where all of us felt something strange. something like sexual energy. A few of the girls even admitted to having done things there with unlikely partners. Despite not being attracted to them, it was like the room had this weird, seductive. I moved out of my apartment and into a different town for about a year. But the dreams about the house continued. For months, they were always pleasant, though dreams of me living there, the house beautifully decorated. I started to feel this longing for the place. But then one day, the dreams just stopped. I stopped thinking about the house altogether and moved on with my life. I was visiting my hometown again recently, and as I was driving through the familiar streets, I decided to pass by the spot where the house had always stood. To my shock, it was gone, completely demolished. I pulled over and just stared at the empty space, trying to wrap my head around it. Apparently, the house had been torn down a few months ago, and then it hit me that was around the same time my dreams about the house stopped. I don't know what it all means, or what really happened in that house, but to this day, it fascinates me. The connection between the house disappearing and my dreams fading away feels more than just a coincidence. Something strange happened there, something I might never fully understand. I remember the summer I spent at my grandparents' house in Knoxville, Tennessee. They lived in a peaceful 2-story home that had been recently built in 2018. Their backyard stretched out to a serene lake, and my grandpa, with his quiet demeanor, spent most of his days fishing from the dock. While I sat watching from a distance, I noticed something curious. While Grandpa focused on his fishing rod, Grandma's attention never seemed to be on the water. Instead, her gaze always lingered on the dark woods across the lake, as if she were waiting for something. It was a bit unsettling. She never once looked at her fishing rod, not even at the bobbing lures. At first, I thought she simply loved the view of the trees, but deep down, I knew there was more to her lingering gaze. My summer visits had become a tradition over the years. I adored my grandparents. They were kind, quiet souls who lived a simple life. I always looked forward to spending time at their house, especially because Grandma had an endless supply of stories. Unlike Grandpa, who mostly told tales about his time in the military, Grandma's stories ranged from funny childhood memories to magical bedtime tales that transported me to other worlds. But there was something special about her, storytelling that I couldn't quite put into words. It felt like she had a magical gift, one that made you feel like you were truly living the story she was telling. Grandpa, on the other hand, was a man of few words, but he had a quiet strength that was palpable. Most of his stories were about his military service, nothing fantastical, but filled with adventure and bravery. I admired him deeply, especially for his outdoor skills. He had an incredible knowledge of fishing and nature when we went out on his boat, cutting through the cool lake water. As the sun rose, I felt completely at peace, but it was Grandma's stories that always captivated me, especially the ones she told at night. Nestled under a cozy quilt in the guest room, I would wait for her to come in and tell me a tale. Her voice, soft and melodic, would fill the room as she wove together stories of nights, magical lands, and, occasionally, scary stories. She didn't tell the scary ones often, but when she did, they were so detailed and vivid that they left a lasting impression on me. One particular night, everything changed. I was snuggled up in bed, waiting for Grandma to come in, as usual. When I heard the soft click of the doorknob, I sat up in anticipation. But this time, instead of asking for a magical or adventurous story, I made a bold request. "Can you tell me a scary story tonight, Grandma?" She looked surprised for a moment, then paused thoughtfully. Her usual mischievous smile faded slightly, replaced by a more serious expression. She glanced out the window, towards the dark woods across the lake. Before turning inside your window, she began in a hushed tone. "They hold something that most people don't know about." A shiver ran down my spine. The room was warm, but her words sent a chill through me. "Every 7 years," she continued, her voice low, "something comes out of those woods. It's been here for thousands of years, and it hunts. It moves silently, crawling on all fours, always searching for its prey." I felt my heart race as she spoke. The familiar trees outside my window now, seeming far more menacing. It's shaped like a man, but twisted. Its limbs are long, unnaturally so, and its skin is black as coal, making it almost impossible to see at night. I swallowed hard, my eyes flicking back to the window. The once comforting silhouette of the trees now felt ominous, as though something might be lurking within. Their shadows. But the worst part, Grandma whispered, leaning in slightly, are its eyes. It has multiple eyes, scattered across its head like a spider. They glow in the dark, piercing through the night. always watching, always waiting. I could barely breathe as she spoke. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as if the creature she described was already out there watching us from the woods. I wanted to tell her to stop, but I was too entranced by the story to speak. People say that it only comes out once every 7 years, she continued. But no one knows exactly when. Those who have seen it, they never live to tell the tale. It takes them, drags them back into the woods, and they're never seen again. By this point, I was terrified. I kept glancing towards the window, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Grandma's voice, usually so comforting, now felt like a weight pressing down on me. And that's why, she said softly, you should never go near those woods. You never know when it might be watching, waiting for its next victim. She finished the story, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. The room was silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting just beyond the edge of the lake. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept thinking about Grandma's story, about the creature lurking in the woods. Part of me knew it was just a story, one of Grandma's many tales meant to entertain and spook me. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was some truth. I would discover just how horrifyingly real that story was. But in that moment, lying awake in my grandparents' house, all I could do was hope that whatever was in the woods stayed far, far away. My grandmother's story still haunted me years after she first whispered it to me. During a summer night in my childhood, her voice was low and hushed, carrying a weight that sent shivers down my spine. She had continued her eerie tale, and though I had begged for a scary story, that evening, I regretted it more with every word she spoke. Sometimes, if it has trouble finding prey, it ventures closer, Grandma said, her voice barely a whisper. Closer to houses searching for unlocked windows. My breath caught in my throat as I imagined those eyes, like the ones she described, scattered across the creature's face peering through the glass. The thought alone sent a jolt of terror through me. I tried to tell myself it was just a story, but her voice had a way of making it feel too real. If it finds an opening, she continued, her eyes dark and serious, it will crawl inside and snatch the closest person, dragging them back to the woods. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the images her words conjured. The warmth of the quilt wrapped around me did nothing to protect me from the sudden chill that filled the room. My heart pounded in my chest. It keeps its victims alive for 7 long years, she whispered, feeding off them slowly, until its hunger returns, and it's time to hunt again. My grip on the blanket tightened until my knuckles were white. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my skin, despite the warmth of the room. I wanted to tell Grandma to stop, but I couldn't find my voice. The fear had silenced me. But don't you worry, Grandma said, her tone softening. As long as we keep the windows locked, we'll be safe. Just remember to do the same at your mom's house. She rose from the bed, her smile comforting yet strained at the edges. It was a smile meant to reassure me, but I could see something else in her eyes. Sliver of unease. She walked toward the window, moving slowly and deliberately. My heart raced as I watched her check the window to make sure it was locked. She stood there for a moment, staring out into the darkness beyond the glass, as if she was making sure the creature wasn't out there, lurking in the woods. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I blurted out the question that had been lodged in my throat. Grandma, have you ever seen it? She paused for what felt like an eternity. A flicker of something I couldn't read crossing her face. But instead of answering, she leaned down and kissed my forehead with a strange intensity. Good night, darling, she whispered before turning to leave the room. The soft click of the door shutting behind her echoed for most of that night, staring at the window, terrified of what I might see. If I looked too long, the familiar silhouette of the woods, once comforting, now held a new kind of menace. I kept expecting to see those eyes my grandma described, a face with multiple eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. My dreams were filled with the creature, its twisted form slithering through the woods. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, like I was stuck in place. In my dream, it caught me, its long arms wrapping around me as it dragged me back toward the dark trees. I could smell the damp earth as I was pulled across the grass, the trees growing larger, their jagged branches reaching out to engulf me. Just as I was about to be swallowed by the woods, I woke up with a gasp. The morning light streamed through the window, casting soft shadows on the ceiling. Everything was peaceful again, but the terror from the night still lingered. In the back of my mind, I took deep breaths, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. As time passed, the nightmares faded, but the creature in Grandma's story remained lodged in a corner of my thoughts. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just a story, but it never fully disappeared. Years later, life took a darker turn for our family. Cancer took my grandmother, stealing her away piece by piece, until there was nothing left but grief. Grandpa was never the same after she passed. He became a quiet, solitary figure, living alone in the house, that once echoed with her stories. It broke my heart to see him like that. Talking about Grandma always brought fresh pain to his face, and though we all tried to move on, the weight of her absence never fully lifted. Time passed, and the grief softened, but her memory stayed with us. Then, during my senior year of high school, something happened that brought everything rushing back. It was late, almost 3 a.m. I had been struggling to fall asleep after a long day. The house was quiet, and I had just started to drift off when I heard it, a sharp tap like something hitting the window. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. My heart raced as the memories of Grandma's story came flooding back. I turned slowly to face the window, my pulse thundering in my ears. My mind screamed that it was just my imagination, just a story, but as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something from the woods was watching. The moonlight was faint, barely filtering through the glass of my window, and it was then that I saw it. A form, dark and misshapen, pressed against the glass, blocking most of the light from coming through. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I squinted, the sliver of moonlight that peeked around its edges revealed its human-lighted, and my breath caught in my throat as I realized this wasn't a dream. This thing was real. The creature's body was human-shaped, but its head was where the horror began. Movement flickered across its face. At first, I thought they were tiny insects crawling over its skin, but then I saw the truth. They weren't insects at all. They were eyelids opening and closing, hundreds of them scanning my room with frantic urgency. I froze in terror. Was I still dreaming? Before I could process the thought, a shadowy limb, long and impossibly thin, began snaking towards the base of my window. Panic surged through me as the sickening sound of the glass sliding up filled the room. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Had I locked the window? My grandmother's story wasn't just a bedtime tale. It was real, and now the creature was here. Terror choked me, my throat tightening as I struggled to breathe. It wasn't supposed to be real, yet here it was. And I had left the window unlocked. Adrenaline took over, and my body moved before my mind could catch up. I scrambled out of bed, feet pounding against the floor. As I bolted towards the door, my hand gripped the doorknob. But before I could pull it open, the door slammed shut in my face. The force threw me backward, sending me sprawling onto the floor. I gasped, my body locking up in terror, my muscles refusing to respond. A strangled cry escaped my lips. As I realized, this thing had trapped me. It was no longer outside the window. In the blink of an eye, it was inside my room. Somehow, impossibly fast, it had moved, and now it hovered above me, looming over the door. One of its grotesque limbs, tipped with a hand like a spider's claw, pressed against the door, holding it shut. Another limb bent at an unnatural angle, splayed its fingers across the wall in a sickening parody of a grip. The head, the thing that shouldn't even be called a head, twisted on its neck in a way that defied any human anatomy. It almost spun entirely around, and when it did, a chorus of eyes, those flickering frantic eyes, locked onto me. My mind scrambled for any flicker of hope, but there was none. I was trapped. I considered jumping out of the window, but the second floor was too high. I'd break a leg and leave myself vulnerable. Besides, that's probably what it wanted me to do, jump. My eyes darted to the wooden baseball bat, leaning against the wall near the door. Without thinking, I lunged for it, the rough wood biting into my hands. As I gripped it tightly, with all the strength I had, I swung the bat, aiming for the creature's body. A sickening thud echoed through the room as the bat connected, sending splinters of wood flying. The creature recoiled slightly, its many eyes flickering in what could have been surprise, but the silence that followed was worse than any noise. It didn't roar or growl. This thing moved with an unnatural quiet, and even as it recoiled, it descended to the floor, its grotesque form unfolding as it crouched, preparing to strike. In a panic, I swung the bat again, connecting with a bone-crunching impact. More shards of wood flew into the air, but the creature barely faltered. Seizing the moment, I bolted past it, flinging the bedroom door open and slamming it shut behind me with a loud bang. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced down the stairs, each step echoing in the eerie silence of the house. Reaching the living room, I fumbled for the light switch, flooding the room with a warm, comforting glow. Panting, I gripped the broken bat. Its splintered end pointed towards the stairs, ready for whatever came next. Suddenly, the front door creaked open. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned. Bat raised, but it wasn't the creature, it was my mom. She stood in the doorway, looking exhausted, her face lined with worry. "There you are," she said, her voice tired but relieved. "What's going on?" Her sentence died midair. Her eyes widened in shock, but before either of us could react, a shadowy limb shot out from behind her. It moved so fast I barely saw it. The limb, tipped with those spidery claws, wrapped around her waist, sinking its talons deep into her flesh. A sickening sound followed as it tore into her skin. My mother let out a strangled gasp. Her scream caught in her throat. The creature, silent as ever, dragged her toward the door, her feet barely touching the ground. I screamed and ran after her, but the thing was too fast. I stumbled, falling face first into the grass outside, watching in horror as my mom's screams grew fainter, swallowed by the woods. I could still see her, thrashing and fighting, but the creature had her in its grip. It was dragging her toward the trees, just like in Grandma's story. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't work. Tears blurred my vision as I heard her final blood-curdling scream before everything went silent. The police came, but what could they do? What could I even tell them? I repeated the story over and over, but they didn't believe me. They looked at me like I was crazy, but what else could I say? Hours passed in a sterile interrogation room, the light above me blinding, as the officers questioned me, searching for some inconsistency in my story. But there was none. I had told them exactly what I saw. Eventually, they released me. There was no evidence, no trace of my mom except for my frantic, tear-streaked face. Now, the search party combs through the woods behind my house, their bloodhounds sniffing the ground, their howls echoing through the trees. But deep down, I know they won't find her. As the dawn breaks, I sit in my room, staring at the window. There on the glass is a large, grotesque handprint, an imprint of those many fingers. A cold realization settles over me. One of Grandma's stories was real.